Hello! Welcome to another comparison video. Today I'm going to be discussing Nancy Drew, The Final Scene. I will be looking at the novel, which was released in 1989, the year I was born, and comparing it with the computer game, which was released 12 years later in 2001. If you are new to my comparison videos, the setup is that I start by talking about the book, which was of course the source material, looking at the plot, the characters, and culprit, and then comparing them with the computer game adaptation. Again, looking at the storyline, the characters, and the culprit. And after that, I will be comparing specific elements between the two. So without further ado, let's begin. So we'll start by looking at the book. This is number 38, entitled The Final Scene, taken from the Nancy Drew Files series. So Her Interactive has gone back to this series for this game. Their first two games, Secrets Can Kill and Stay Tuned for Danger, were also derived from the Nancy Drew Files series, whereas games 3 and 4, Message in a Haunted Mansion and Treasure of the Royal Tower, were taken from the Nancy Drew Mystery Paperback series. So in this story we have local star Brady Armstrong, who is originally from River Heights. He's come back to town to promote his latest film at the Century Cinema, and this is a theater that's set to be demolished initially in a month's time. That timetable gets moved up to 3 days instead as the story unfolds. So Nancy, Bess, and George are in town, and they are hoping to see Brady, in particular Bess. She used to have a crush on him back when they were in school. And she decides they're going to sneak into the theater so that she can have some one-on-one time with Brady. And she worked at the cinema for a summer, so she's familiar with all the ways to get into the building. So they sneak in, and she goes alone into his dressing room and waits for him to turn up. Nancy and George hang out nearby. They actually hide in another room. They don't want to get caught on the premises when they're not supposed to be there. But they do see Brady go by. He goes to enter his dressing room, and then he screams and runs out. Someone in a ski mask tried to grab him. When he ran out, the person then took Bess, who they'd already had gagged, and kidnapped her. The girls rush in. Brady comes and follows, and Bess is gone. They then find out that there's a secret passageway. They search it, but they can't find Bess. So Bess has been taken. Nancy and George are in a tizzy, and with help of the police, they search the theater and interrogate their suspects, many of whom are famous. So Brady, his co-star, their manager, also some local activists, and other people who are on site. And the timetable to demolish the theater has been moved up to 3 days, as the owner doesn't believe that this kidnapping could be real. He just wants the theater knocked down. And Nancy is trying to convince the police that Bess is still on site. They have difficulty with this because they can't find evidence, and the police have searched high and low and haven't found Bess, so they don't believe she's there. So this has been a sort of a tricky part for Nancy. She firmly believes Bess is still in the theater, and she's trying to stop this demolition in order to find her. And what we learn is Brady was the intended kidnapping victim, which is pretty obvious at the very beginning because the person in his dressing room had tried to grab him. And the purpose of the kidnapping is to stop the demolition. So the characters in the book include, of course, Brady Armstrong, his co-star Deirdre McCullough, Simon Mueller, who is their manager, Joseph Hughes, the longtime caretaker of the theater, Nicholas Falcone, who is a local activist who's trying to stop the theater from being demolished, his grandfather, Louis Falcone, who with his father had done some of the plaster work in that theater decades earlier, and Bart Anderson, who owns the theater and wants to knock it down. Later on in the story, Nicholas winds up being kidnapped by Bart Anderson. Bart is so frustrated that his demolition isn't quite going as planned, and he believes Nicholas took the girl, and he's trying to find out through him where the girl is just so he can get his building demolished. As far as Bess's kidnapping, that was actually perpetrated by Joseph Hughes. He was the initial kidnapper. And this is all uncovered. Everyone who's involved in the kidnappings winds up arrested. Bess is saved, and the theater is also saved. So that is the essence of the novel. So next we'll look at the adaptation to the computer game. So this was the 5th game that Her Interactive released, which was also titled the final scene, which is an appropriate title for the story. I'm glad they kept that title. In this version, we have Nancy and her friend Maya Wen, and they're visiting the Royal Palladium Theatre in St. Louis. And Maya is a reporter, and she wants to interview Brady. So she's not sneaking in, she's actually there for a scheduled interview. And they're trying to do this before the theatre is to be demolished, which is again in 3 days. When Maya enters the dressing room, Nancy hears her scream, she runs in. Maya has disappeared, and it turns out she's been kidnapped. Brady, once again, was the intended target, but because someone else walked into the dressing room, the kidnapper panicked and took her instead. So Nancy spends her meager 3 days searching this ancient building and questioning the suspects. And she's trying to save Maya, but she's also trying to prove that Wave of the Future, which is the company that owns the building, doesn't actually have full ownership of the theater. And the point of this is, if someone else co-owns the theater, the Wave of the Future can't make that decision to knock it down. Someone else also has the power to determine whether that building stays standing or not. So this is a great subplot to the story that I really like. So over the course of the days, Nancy finds evidence that Maya is being held in the building. And this is important because, again, the police don't believe she's actually there. But as she finds evidence and even sees Maya, Maya goes missing again, and the evidence disappears before the police arrive. So this is a real struggle for Nancy, trying to prove that Maya is still there, to keep that building from being demolished so that she can find her friend. So the characters we have are Brady Armstrong, who again is an actor, Simone Mueller, his agent, Joseph Hughes, the caretaker of the building, Nicholas Falcone, an activist who's trying to save the building, Sergeant Mac Ramsey, who's the police officer who Nancy communicates with about the kidnapping, and then Eustacia Andropov and Sherman Trout, who are phone contacts Nancy speaks with once each, who help with the storyline about the ownership. So once the story unfolds and reaches the 3rd day, we learn that Joseph Hughes is the kidnapper. He took Maya, although he'd intended to take Brady, and again the purpose was to stop the demolition. Nancy winds up finding Maya, alerting the police to her presence still in the building, halting the demolition, and saving her. And of course having Joseph then arrested. So that's the course of the computer game. And now I'd like to compare the book and the game, see what's been changed, what's been kept the same. So starting with the storyline, it's pretty much the same. So we have this final showing at a theater that's going to be demolished, and someone, in the book it's Bess, in the game it's Maya, is kidnapped, although the intended target was Brady. In either, or in both versions rather, Brady is never the one who's actually taken. It's always a friend of Nancy. And Nancy has just 3 days to solve this case before the building is knocked down. In addition to this, the game also has a story about the proof of ownership. Nancy's investigating who rightfully can make that decision about knocking down the theater. Our location is a little bit different. In the book, it's set in River Heights at the Century Cinema. In the computer game, it's set in St. Louis at the Royal Palladium Theatre. And you'll notice the name of the theatre is different. Royal Palladium Theatre is actually not unique to the game. In the book, we learn that the cinema used to be called the Royal Palladium Theatre. And this is important because the kidnapper, when he's referring to saving the theater, he doesn't call it the Century Cinema, he calls it the Royal Palladium Theatre. And Nancy eventually tweaks to the fact that only older people would know that name, which narrows her suspects down to Louis Falcone, because he's an older gentleman who worked in the theater, and of course Joseph Hughes, who worked for decades and still does in the theater, and he would know it as the Royal Palladium. So that's actually a very important name that comes up in that original story in the book. A neat thing to compare as well are the changes from male characters to female characters. Normally I point out that some of the names have changed, which technically does happen in this game, but only because they've moved from a male character to a female character. So in the book we have Simon Mueller. In the game, he becomes she, female, Simone Mueller. And then Lewis's grandfather was named Louis becomes Louisa. So they've changed from the two of the characters from male to female, and the names are still very similar. Simon to Simone, Louis to Louisa. So there's a little change that was made, while still being fairly similar between mediums. So next I'd like to discuss the characters, and most of the characters are fairly similar, with the exception of Brady. He's actually, in my view, quite different between the book and the game. So in both versions, he's a young actor who's in town to promote his latest film. In the book, he grew up in River Heights. He graduated a few years before Nancy and her friends, and the girls kind of knew him. And he's kind-hearted, and he genuinely wants to help find Bess. He does hold back a little bit. He's a bit concerned that Simon, his manager, might be involved in the kidnappings, but otherwise he tries to be very helpful. In the game, he comes off initially as being helpful and a nice person, but as we get to the third day, we learn that he is a descendant of J.J. Thompson, who was the original owner of the building, and that he, Brady, is the one behind the demolition, and he doesn't want it stopped. And because of this drive to get this building knocked down, he hides evidence. He does this in order to ensure the demolition goes through. So here he's being sneaky and dangerous. He's withholding information. In the book, he doesn't necessarily withhold information. He just doesn't want to mention concerns about his manager that he doesn't have proof for. In the game, he knows he has important information, and he lies about where he's found it, and he hides other pieces of information because he wants the building knocked down. He doesn't believe Maya is on site. So personality-wise, Brady is quite different between the two mediums. Next, I'll look at Simon or Simone. So this is the manager for Brady and for Deirdre when we're looking at the book. And he or she utilizes the kidnapping to promote the actor. That personality, that behavior is the same. In the book, it's Simon, so male. He's bold and he's unscrupulous. And he's previously set up situations where his clients have been so-called kidnapped. And this is the concern that Brady has in the book that he doesn't want to tell Nancy. He doesn't have proof that Simon had Bess kidnapped, but he can see it as being a possibility, and he doesn't want to admit that to Nancy, partly because he doesn't have proof, but he also doesn't want to anger his manager. So that's a concern about Simon in the book. In the game, it's Simone. She's female, she's snarky, and she's relentless. And she sends a funeral wreath to gain media attention for Brady. In the book, there is a funeral wreath, but it's sent by Joseph. So that's sort of where we have some differences, really ultimately about sex, so from male to female. That's the difference for Simon/Simone. Both are using the attention to create greater fame for their client, which is horrendous, by the way. So then we'll look at Joseph. He's a longtime caretaker of the theater. He's been there for decades. Everyone knows him. He's considered very kind. And he is the one who's actually trying to stop the demolition by way of kidnapping a celebrity. He'd intended to kidnap Brady, but he inadvertently takes a civilian hostage instead. Again, in the book it's Bess, in the computer game it's Maya, not his intended target. In the book, he's known Nancy and her friend for years because he's worked at the theater and it's all local, so everyone knows everyone. And he's not a suspect until sort of toward the end of the game, where they realize again that use of royal palladium, and they learn information that an older gentleman had taken blueprints of the building, which narrows that suspect field to Louis and Joseph. But initially, no one thinks about him as being a suspect. And he's the one who sends the funeral wreath to Nancy. As previously mentioned, when looking at Simone, she had sent it in the game, but in the original story, it's Joseph who sends it. In the game, so the only thing that's really different is that he claims he'll move to Greasewood, Arizona to open a theater with his brother. That storyline's not part of the book. But overall, he's the same person. He's a caretaker, considered kind, not really a suspect at the beginning. Next, we'll look at Nicholas, who also is fairly similar between mediums. He's an activist, and he's determined to save that theater. He does not want it knocked down. And a big part of this is because his family members did plaster work in that old building. So there's some sentimental value that that building has for him and for his family. In the book, he tries to save historical buildings from demolition. It's not just theaters, it's any ancient structure, basically. He also saves George. In one instance, she's chasing who they think might be the kidnapper up a catwalk. The kidnapper unbolts one side of it and it falls, and so she's sort of dangling in midair, and he goes up and saves her, which sort of creates some conflicting feelings about whether or not to consider Nick a suspect or not, because he saved George. And he came in after the person on the catwalk who had unbolted it had disappeared. So theoretically, he could have backtracked and, come back and saved George. So he's on their suspect list, even though he's done this really important thing. But it's hard for them to draw the line of, is Nick on our suspect list or not? Really creates these conflicting feelings for them. He does have some concerns, as we learn later on, that his grandfather may have kidnapped Bess, and that's again because of the use of the term Royal Palladium. Most people in River Heights know it as Century Cinema. The kidnapper refers to it as the Royal Palladium, as does his grandfather, Louis. And Nick also used to work at the cinema, so he does know it inside and out. And he's family friends with Joseph, because his grandfather and great-grandfather had done work there, and he spent so much time there. He himself used to work there. He knows Joseph. And then late in the story, he winds up kidnapped as well by Bart Anderson, the owner of the theater. So we've quite the backstory for Nicholas in the book. In the game, I think he does as well. It's just not quite as intense. In the game, he specifically tries to save theaters from demolition. It's not just any old building. Had It is about saving illustrious theaters. And he's quite antagonistic about Brady. He does not like him. Brady doesn't seem to like him either. In the book, we don't have that relationship. The two don't really meet. They're never really together. So we don't have a sense of their relationship. But certainly in the game, it's made clear that those two do not care for one another. Nick also has a really poor relationship with the police. He has some bad history with them. That's not in the book. And also in the game, it's his great-grandmother who was involved with the plasterwork. And she was never credited for the artistry that she did in the building, which is something that really bothers Nick, and that's sort of his main driving force with trying to save this particular theater. He wants to get that credit that his family deserved long ago. So then I want to talk about some characters that differ who are not in both mediums. So in the book we have Deirdre, so she's an actress. She's really sweet and she doesn't drive the story in any way. She's the one who tells Nancy that Simon has previously set up kidnappings, but we didn't really need that for the computer game, so her storyline wasn't important in the game, so she's been removed. Bart Anderson is the owner of the building and is the one who's decided to demolish it. It's an important storyline, and they've taken, they being her interactive, have taken those characteristics of him and put them in Brady. So we have that storyline incorporated into a different character, which allowed for him not to be in the game. Louis Falcone becomes Louisa Falcone in the game, and has, long passed on. So they've sort of changed that a little bit. He wasn't necessary for the story. They didn't need him as another suspect. So he's taken out, not included in the game. And then we have Brenda Carlton, who I wanted to mention. She's only in a small portion of one chapter in the book. The reason I bring her up is for those who don't read the books or who haven't read this particular book or this particular series but are very familiar with the games. Brenda is in Alibi and Ashes, the computer game, and she's a physical character in that. She's a suspect. I just wanted to point her out because she's actually a regular character in this series. She's not unique to that game or to one of the two books that game is based on. We actually see her fairly often. She was in Secrets Can Kill, which I pointed out when I did that comparison as well. And same with Detective Ryan. Again, for those who have played Alibi and Ashes, he's referenced in that. He went to Pancake City, and Chief McGinnis was none too pleased about that. So Detective Ryan, again, is not unique to that game. He is a regular character in the Nancy Drew Files series. And I think he was also in either Secrets Can Kill or Stay Tuned for Danger, and I didn't mention it. I don't think he's present. I think he's just referenced in one of those two books. But again, he is a regular character from this series, and I just thought it might be interesting for those who only know of his name from the game to know that that he's been around for a while. Same with Brenda Carlton. And then if we look at extra characters from the game who are not in the book, they're all phone contacts. So we have Eustacia Andropov, and she is, sort of through marriage, considered a relative of Harry Houdini. Harry Houdini, which I'll talk about in a moment, isn't in the book, so because he's not in the book, Eustacia Andropov wouldn't have been in the book. But they've created her character because of this storyline involving Harry Houdini. So that's why she's in the game. Same with Sherman Trout, someone who Eustacia spoke with and who has documents about Harry Houdini. So he was created for the game because of this new storyline. And then there's Sergeant Mac Ramsey, who is the detective who Nancy speaks with in the game. He's not in the book because in the book she's talking to Detective Ryan, someone local who she's known for a long time. So they're all new. Those three characters are new to the game, and they're all phone contacts. And they're there because of, changes from the original story. So now, I'd like to talk very briefly about Harry Houdini. He's a real-life magician, very famous, and he's been incorporated into the game. He was not mentioned in the book at all. So his addition to the game is sort of unique to Her Interactive, and I thought it was really cool. And he's included, I think, for two reasons. One is just as an educational element. It's really nice when Her Interactive includes historical facts or information about skills, real people, bits of history. In the earlier games, they seem to try to do that quite intentionally. So I think that's one reason why Harry Houdini is mentioned. And sort of the setting worked to include Harry Houdini. But his inclusion also helps to drive the ownership storyline, which again is unique to the game. There is no concern in the book about dual ownership of the building. That was created specifically for the game. So he's been included just to add some neat elements, some educational elements, but to also drive this story about who can actually demolish this theater. And it also leads to the magician's room, which is a space specific to the game. The cages and sort of this magic trick that you can do on the stage, which we learn about on day 2. So this adds an extra depth to the computer game, which I certainly appreciate. I think it's fantastic. So then finally, after all my rambling, I'll talk about the ending. So at the ending of the story, the demolition is set to begin before our kidnapping victim has even been located. So that's where things are the same, and then it sort of differs from there. So in the book, Bart initially moves up the demolition time. So first from a month to 3 days, and then it was supposed to be in a couple of hours, and then he says, no, let's get this sucker started, because he's just had it with not being able to find where the kidnapping victim is, and he just doesn't want to believe she's in the building, so he's just going to have it knocked down so that there's no more drama about this. Nancy convinces him that they know that Bess is in the building. He's trying to get his demolition team on the phone. He can't reach them. And all of them are off-site. This is when they find Nick. Bart has kidnapped Nick. Bess and George are with them. So they then speed off back to town, to the demolition site. They get there, and the wrecking ball makes its first swing at the building before they can stop it. Fortunately, it doesn't do much damage. Bart is able to stop demolition at that point. And then Nancy, George, and Nicholas run into the building looking for Joseph, because they know Joseph at this point is behind it all, and they suspect he's in the building, that he wants to go down with it. So they go to find him and then to find Bess. When they initially find Joseph, he runs off because he just can't handle it, and he winds up being cornered by the trio. They learn that he has the blueprints that were missing from City Hall. He takes them out and shows them where Bess is hidden, which is sort of up in this attic area, which was used for cooling. And that's sort of the same as the game. You have to go up to an attic area to find Maya. So then they find Bess, they save her, and then not only is Joseph arrested, but so is Bart because he kidnapped Nick. And then the theater is permanently saved from destruction. They wind up actually not just temporarily stopping it, but permanently saving it, even though they've knocked one of the walls a little bit. And then that's sort of how the book wraps up. In the game, Nancy secretly stays in the theater, so she doesn't have a chance to get any of it stopped. She doesn't come running in and people seeing her run in. She's just hidden herself in a closet in the projection room. The police don't know she's still there because she's determined to find Maya. As she is going to leave the projection room, Joseph shows up. He locks her in, but Nancy knows that there's another secret room above her. She finds that hidden passageway, which leads to evidence of the shared ownership of the theater, but also to Maya. So again, Maya's been found in an attic space. Rather than just taking Maya out of this locked area, Nancy needs to stop the demolition first, so she has to turn on the marquee, which takes a little bit because Joseph is briefly in the way. He turns up again. But Nancy turns on the marquee. The police and demo team realize people are in the building. The demolition comes to a crashing halt. Joseph is arrested, Maya is saved, and the theater is saved, in part because of the evidence Nancy found about co-ownership, and Brady just commits to no longer destroying the building. And that's how the game wraps up. So the ending's a little bit different, which is often the case between book and game. But there we go. So just to conclude, there are minimal differences between the novel and the game. The key characters, who would be Brady, Simon or Simone, Joseph and Nicholas, and then the plot points about someone being kidnapped to stop the demolition, those are adapted from the book into the game. That all basically stays the same. The game also incorporates the historical element of Harry Houdini, and through that, the subplot of co-ownership. Who actually owns the building? It's not just Bart Anderson or Wave of the Future. There's someone else who also has claim to the building. So that's new to the game. Some of the characters were eliminated, such as Deirdre and Bart, although Bart has sort of been merged with, well, absolutely has been merged with the character of Brady from the book to the game. So little differences there in terms of characters, which often is the case. And then there were more female characters included in the game than there were in the original story. And when we look at who was eliminated from the book, Deirdre, who was a girl, she's taken out. So without her, all of the suspects would have been men. Simon, Brady, Joseph, and Nicholas. So her interactive changed Simon to Simone, creating a female character. It doesn't quite balance things, but at least it's not an entirely male cast of suspects. So I like that they made that small change. And then, of course, Louis Falcone, who was a physical character and who was removed, became Louisa Falcone. So another female character, although we don't see her, she is referenced. And then we have some events from the book that were incorporated into the game. So that would be for instance, the hidden passageway that connects from the men's dressing room to the women's dressing room. That's taken from the book. It's actually from wardrobe to wardrobe. In the game, it's in Brady's dressing room, it's behind a rack of clothes rather than the wardrobe itself. But that also is an element taken from the book. In a different room when Nancy's chasing Joseph, he disappears behind a rack of clothes, and Nancy discovers that there's actually a hidden door in that wall. So they have incorporated two different hidden passageways in that men's dressing room in the game, which is kind of neat. Other elements that were the same are, I believe, the falling Klieg light. In the book, as I was reading it again, there's a light that falls and nearly crushes Nancy. And I think that actually happens in the game. I just haven't had it happen in my recent, 5 playthroughs, but I can picture it happening. I'm pretty sure that event actually does happen in the game, depending on your sequence of events, how you play the game. I have this tendency to skip it, and I've forgotten it happens. And this is assuming I'm right. Like I said, I can picture it. I don't think I'm just picturing the falling Klieg light from Stay Tuned for Danger. I'm pretty sure it happens in the game of the final scene as well. And then other things that are kept the same are finding the evidence of our kidnapped victim. In the book, we've an earring that belonged to Bess that's found, and we're having difficulty proving to the police that she's on site. In the game, it's pizza boxes and a shoe, which also go missing after they've initially been found, and again, trying to prove to the police that Maya is on site. So these events are the same as well, although some of the details and setup may be a little bit different. So overall, the plot is the same, which has been the case with the previous 4 games as well. So Joseph Hughes kidnaps a friend of Nancy. In the game, it's Maya. In the original story, it's Bess. And the kidnapping occurs in a building that's set to be demolished in a mere 3 days' time. And it's done in desperate hope of saving an old building from destruction. And that is my comparison. So once again, which I just noted, the book to game transition is, pretty similar. The main storyline is the same. Most of the characters are the same. There are a few tweaks here and there. But ultimately, it's the same story, which I appreciate. I mean, I don't know that I like the book as much as I like the game. Reading the book, I felt like the timing felt a little off. Everything felt a bit rushed. It was also almost too chaotic. But the game, I think, delivers the story really well. And I love that subplot involving Nick Falcone's great-grandmother and the ownership question. Who actually can make that decision about knocking down the building because of this bet involving Harry Houdini? And again, Harry Houdini wasn't in the original story. I liked this involvement of this historical figure. So I think the game really brings the book to life in kind of a better way than the original story. And I don't know if I think that because I've played the game so many times, and I played it before I'd ever read it. And human beings, we quite naturally tend to prefer our original versions of things. When there's a remake, we often don't like it as much as the original. So I don't know if that's the case for me with these 2 stories. I'm not sure that it is, because the game, I think, is different enough and the setting is done so well. I think that's part of it, is I just love the building. I love this really romantic story that's been created through the game. Yeah, I think it's great. So again, just to sum up, book to game, very similar. Her Interactive really stuck to the source material. They made some changes here and there, which they always do, and that's always going to happen. Nothing's going to be a 100% carbon copy of the source material when you're making an adaptation like this. And I think they did a great job. It was a great story when it came to life. I mean, I like the game better than the book. I think it was a great idea, and I really appreciate the work they put into it. And again, this is a sort of a special story for me, not just because I love the setup of it, and I just enjoy sort of the plot, and it's different from the first 4 games, but this was the game that first brought me to the message board, because I got stuck trying to move on day 1, and had I not found the message board, I may never have become a moderator and not had that, that part of my life be the way it was. So this sort of sits in a special compartment in my heart. And I'm going to, I guess, leave it there. Thank you for watching. I hope you get the chance to read some of the books yourselves, be it this one or a different one, and compare them to maybe your favorite game, and see how you feel about it and see what was changed. I know as I get on in the games, there are going to be more and more differences, but for now, everything's kept pretty much the same, and I think that continues for quite a while. And I'm looking forward to making those comparisons in the near future. So thank you again. Have a great day and stay safe out there. Bye-bye now.